Hi everyone, welcome to Module 6, Unit 1. The focus of this unit is moving from coding to identifying meaning in the data or interpretation. And this is part of the module on interpretation and meaning making. So we have 3 learning objectives for this short module. I hope by the end of this module you'll be able to describe the analytic steps that come after the coding processes. You'll be able to distinguish interpretation from coding. Coding is a process to organize your data to prepare for interpretation and meaning making. And then describe ways to convey the meaning in the data. What we often see in qualitative research studies is the use of themes, thematic descriptions of findings in the data, but that's not the only way to convey meaning in the data. So I'm borrowing from Strauss and Corbin here to just review when we're thinking about meaning making, and that can be used in a couple of different ways in qualitative research, but in this way we're using it to describe identifying the meaning of the data. And this is again why your analytic approach and your research question are really important to know. But there's basically 13 tactics to making meaning or making sense of our data. So we can try to figure out, so in these data, what goes with what. This involves identifying patterns, themes across the data, thinking about issues of plausibility, of clustering, and I'll give you some examples of this. So this kind of what goes with what. Another method in qualitative research is really pile sorting, making piles, categorizing. Does this make sense? Do these hang together? Do they always hang together? Those kinds of things. In trying to make sense, we can integrate other kinds of data. We can make metaphors as part of the analysis. The making of metaphors can help us kind of answer these questions of whether the emerging findings are really holding together. Do they hold together metaphorically? We can basically count what is there, identify what is there. This is this kind of tension between qualitative and quantitative, which just counting the number of things doesn't exactly tell you the meaning in the data, but it definitely points you to something, and I'll give you an example of that. Another tactic to try to make sense is really like sharpening our understanding. So within the data, a lot of qualitative researchers do what they call a constant comparative analysis, making contrast within the data as they're doing their coding and their memoing. Have I seen this before? Is this different than something that I've seen before? Can I compare it to something that came later? Other tactics are differentiating in the data. Can I differentiate domains or variables that might be emerging in the data? Can I see relationships within the data? Can I basically start to think about the relationships between these variables or domains that are emerging in the variable? How are they operating together? And through all of this sense making, often we're looking to build theory. Is there enough evidence here? Is there a chain of evidence? Does it hold together coherently such that I can identify a theory? And I'll give an example of a recent doctoral student who's built theory from data in that way. So typically what we're interested in when we're doing qualitative data analysis in public health is we're trying to identify data that can move us towards understanding. So we are typically looking for patterns, for themes. We do some counting, some clustering, we identify some metaphors, and we're trying to understand. So this making comparisons and contrasting. So in my experience in public health research and practice, these are kind of our typical interests as part of the analysis process. So as you saw in previous modules, we identify codes. That process of identifying codes is an analytic process, so that starts very early. And we move towards developing a code book. So we've identified this in previous modules, but I want to reiterate, typically a code book includes the name of the code, whether that code is a standalone code or a code that serves as a parent code or a child code, so something that is higher level than or sub code to a larger code. We describe a code definition or a code description, and we identify inclusion and exclusion criteria. And this is important because we're looking for nuances in data, so we're trying to identify a code that really names a specific phenomena, a particular something, and we'll often be coding and we'll say, I'm not sure if this fits this code or not. And because of that, we often add to code books examples. So an example in this code book that I excerpt from a much larger code book on my research with precarious work is the code is called Barriers to Work. This is a descriptive code. It's a very clean, clear code. It identifies something that describes barriers to work. Barriers include things like language, documentation status, educational attainment, incarceration, transportation, work in the community. So these actually could, and in this study actually are subcodes to the barriers to work. But in this case, this is a code that's flagging content in the data that describes these barriers. Now, this excludes challenges at work or keeping work. So this really is the barrier to attaining work. And an example from the data is you can't get a job in the suburbs because you have no transportation back. So that job really isn't accessible to you. That's a barrier. Now, in my code books, I always add, how did this code come to us? Did it emerge a priori? So it came from our research question, like these top two did. Did it come from our focus group guide? So it came from our instrument that we developed to explore this research? Or did it emerge from the data? And those are usually the three codes that I have to characterize the coding process. Here's just another example from another code book that was used in a community health assessment at a neighborhood level. It gives some examples of inclusion, exclusion, and example quotes. And often we take exactly from the language of the people whose contribution, whose data kind of inspired this code, and that is to help us keep organized on this code. So once we have everything coded, what a lot of qualitative data analysts like to think about is the code basically the coding of the data provides the scaffolding of, or the skeleton for, the analysis. But once you have the codes done, you're far from actually interpreting the meaning in the data. So we want to think about, what are we looking for in this data? Most of my data is exploratory, is using a grounded theory approach or a social constructionist approach, where we're really thinking about how people's lived experience serve to have them socially construct their reality. So we are privileging the meaning making that people make as part of their experiences. And so I might look at code clusters and code relationships and start to identify some patterns that's emerging in the data. So this is actually just a screenshot from Atlas TI. Atlas TI has a nice function, unlike Deduce, where you can draw relationships between codes. So in this case, the code's clustered around these two topics. So fear of deportation, repercussions, and how this might impact help seeking, and the neighborhood being an immigration portal, both kind of good and bad things that might come to that. And both of these topics interact with each other and inform this overall impact of immigration on community health. You can see in the boxes here the codes. These are codes, and it shows you how often that code might be used. And so that's frequency, which is another thing we can look at. Frequency is counting, as I said earlier, right? Looking at how many codes. And I'll give an example of that. So when we're working with our codes and trying to identify what do we have in the data, there's some specific qualitative considerations that kind of come to mind. One is just to remember this coding process is a process of grouping evidence and identifying labels. How we group and the names that we give those groups are really important. So in my research, that coding needs to be done in partnership with people who experience the phenomena of interest. So that means that early on in the analytic process, we're trying to privilege the meaning making of the people who experience this. That really attends to issues of trustworthiness of the data. The second thing is that the coding and the memoing that informs the coding helps build a discussion that convinces the reader that the interpretation or the meaning that you make really came from the data. So we're basically building a skeleton or scaffolding to convince people to make sure that our analysis is trustworthy, that the theme or the findings really came from the data themselves. And unlike quantitative research, the qualitative researcher really gets involved in the analysis. And being involved in the analysis means that we need to tend to issues of positionality and reflexivity. And that's a module in and of itself because it's so important to qualitative research. So that's Unit 3 within this module. So another thing to think about is in qualitative research, we tend to talk about moving towards saturation. So we're really moving towards a point in which we feel good about the findings. We feel like we don't need to collect any more data to better understand this phenomenon. Now, it's really hard to know when you're at that point, but as you're doing the analysis, unlike quantitative research, in qualitative research, you really can stop and say, I might need other kind of data to understand this phenomenon. I might need more. I might need to do more interviews, do more focus groups, or really use a different kind of data. So for example, you might be doing focus groups with young people on bladder health, something I've done, and realize that method may not be optimal to understand the experiences of young people around an issue that's kind of stigmatized and icky for young people, that maybe an interview is best to understand this. So you'd actually change your methodology to make sure you are moving towards saturation of your research question. So you're never exactly sure, but you reach data saturation when you realize you're not finding any new insight. And it's the point at which the researcher begins to hear similar thoughts, perspectives, and responses from more or all of the participants. So that is this kind of pattern, looking across your data for a pattern. So it's the point at which if you're going to do more data collection, it really would be redundant because you reached saturation. So I'm going to give you a quick example from our work in Little Village and North Lawndale, exploring residents' experiences with precarious work. So this was a mixed methods research study, and I'm just talking here about the focus group. So we were interested in how residents experience work and how they perceive work impacts their health. So just to give you a sense, I've used this as an example in a couple of other modules. We did 12 focus groups. This description kind of shows who participated in the focus group, who served with moderators, how many participants, and how long the focus groups were. This is a description of the focus group participant types. The reason I share this with you is it's really important to give context to your findings. You don't want to jump right into your findings without people knowing your research question and your methods and who participated. But I want to emphasize our approach to the analysis and how we tried to move from coding to interpretation. So as I said before, we developed a code book in a participatory way. So we use qualitative data analysis think tanks. These were groups of people who were either researchers at UIC or community members in our 2 partner communities. And we did the analysis with the audio data. So this is an example of where when we went to transform the audio data to textual, it didn't feel right. We were missing too much, and we realized we wanted to analyze these data in their original form. And so we met by community area and by language so that the analysis could be done in the original language. We went through each focus group and we identified audio clips in which there was a great deal of meaning. So what this means is we were able to exclude audio for which there was just not a lot of depth of conversation. In this case, the researchers made the choice of those audios, but we had a rationale and we kind of explained why we thought this approach was not going to lose anything too critical. Then as a group, we listened and debriefed the audio clip. We had a set of prompts that we debriefed, both written form and then oral. And through that, we developed the code books. So what's important about this is that our code book was really grounded in the data and in that preliminary interpretation of the meaning of the data by by a group of researchers that represented both academia and the community. This allowed us to adapt and adjust the code book and really prepare to address the trustworthiness of coders, the reliability of coders, the degree to which they would code the same. So then we applied the codes to the data, and we selected analytic codes to examine more in depth, so to really move from coding to interpretation. And we did a couple things with the codes. We looked at code frequency, co-occurrence, and focus group type by count. I'm going to give you some examples. This word cloud here just shows frequency by the size of the code. These are all codes. So issues related to discrimination and the nature of work in the community emerged as most frequent. That doesn't tell us much. It just tells us that we coded those things a lot. But what we did is we worked in partnership with the people who moderated the focus groups, and were able to focus on the relationships and how the experiences were embodied by individuals. So here's just another example of our code frequency. Again, this alone doesn't tell us much, but it's a visual depiction of what we have here, which is an important preliminary stage of qualitative data analysis. We then looked at co-occurrence. So these are all the codes that we used. And if I had more room, I'd put all the codes up here too. We had 31 codes. And we could see how often these codes co-occurred and what codes occurred together. In some cases, we might anticipate codes that might be coded together all the time. In some cases, it provides new insight for us. So the numbers in red and green speak to the frequency of co-occurrence. This is a way in which Cactus allows you to start to cluster and to group and see what's emerging in the data. So from this, we were able to look at clusters and start thinking about what's emerging in terms of buckets or preliminary themes. So we were able to, as a group, say, you know, what residents are describing in these focus groups is that there are few decent jobs available, but it's not just that. And then each bullet below kind of describes the nuances of what emerged under too few decent jobs. Now, these don't all perfectly align with codes. The codes were just the map to help us get there. The second bucket that emerged is people talked about that this pathway to securing any work is fractured, that there seem to not be decent pathways to getting good work at the neighborhood level. Residents also talked about the work that they can get is exploitive and difficult. And lastly, residents talked about unhealthy work. So this is a word that we put on a phenomena, but work that is not decent, that does not kind of match with human dignity and expectations. It has a great impact, and it impacts not just the worker, but the family and the community health. And in several ways, the domains follow below. So this is kind of our bucket list. This is everything that's emerging. And from there, we were able to identify themes under this cross-cutting theme. So the overall, we were able to characterize the consequences of the inequalities experienced by the residents, such that their social resources were strained. And this played out in three different ways. Systematic marginalization from healthy work or decent work. Once people get work, a hostility, a contextual, structural hostility to maintain work. A toxic workplace was another way we thought we might describe that, but decided not to. And then issues related to people's rights, agency, and autonomy. So these are just overall theme names. We ended up identifying examples in the data of each of these themes, so that when we went out to member check our findings, which is the focus of another module, the next one, the next unit in this module, you can see how we member checked. Instead of using kind of rich narrative description, we used composite stories of examples that were given in the data to characterize that theme. So overall, those were our themes, but what's important is in participatory action research is that you're really looking for so what can be done. And so across those themes and that cross-cutting theme, we were able to identify some long-term goals. And with qualitative research and public health, typically you are investing in this kind of research so that you can identify new ways to support, intervene, to make change. So this interpretation and meaning making really is this constant interplay of trying to be true to the data and accurately interpret the meaning, but be sensitive, be able to perceive subtle nuances, be open to new meaning, and really questioning what's going on, to whom does this matter, what is the meaning, and even again one's own positionality and reflexivity with respect to the data. What do I see, what's going on, what does it mean that I see this, and does that mean this is really how it is? And this is why we do this in partnership with a lot of people with diverse experiences so that they can help to identify the meaning in the data. The last thing a qualitative researcher should do is kind of take the data back to their own office and try to unpack, identify meaning in data acontextually like that. So some common ways to frame themes. What we typically see in qualitative manuscripts are 3 themes, maybe with some sub-themes, with a cross-cutting theme like the one that I just gave, or you might have one major theme with several dimensions. Mostly this is because it's difficult to convey qualitative research findings, kind of keeps people's attention. There isn't a p-value or numeric symbol of meaning. And 3 kind of helps things hang together. When we have lots of complicated findings, we end up having multiple manuscripts to describe that, rather than try to hold it all in one manuscript and have people try to be able to understand what that means. So this is a focus of another module, the Unit 2, Module 7, Data Display, but I just wanted to explain that findings can be presented in lots of different ways. I gave an example here of narrative themes, but there are examples of graphics, graphical depictions of meaning. I gave an example of my doctoral student who came up with a theoretical model. So she had a visual depiction of what emerged across 31 stories. In our precarious work study, we've been developing composite stories because our themes aren't a great way to have a discussion with community members, but if we can talk about a story that really illustrates the findings, that can be a better way of translating our findings or communicating our findings. There's an article on Blackboard with respect to this module about a poem that's a result of qualitative research study with people who've had open heart surgery. The poem is a creative, really cool way to display the findings. We've been playing around with the use of graffiti art to describe findings, performance art, and there's lots of examples of that in the Blackboard module extra resources. So that's all for the Module 6, Unit 1. Please go to the quiz for some additional learning. Thank you so much.